Okay, thanks, David. So this is a short paper, but there are a lot of ideas in here. So I'll see what I can get through in the time that I'm allotted. And if I don't get through it, just cut me off and tell me to shut up. Got some simple stories that I'm going to talk about and draw some analogies to doctrines in the law to see whether they serve as justifications for the net neutrality norm. So the first thing to say is that net neutrality is an appealing concept. It suggests immediately an open, fair process, and so the term itself conditions you to be supportive of the idea. And also it consists of a fairly simple regulatory norm that providers of content transported through the networks of broadband firms cannot be charged different prices by the broadband firms for the service of transporting their content. Thus, a firm that provides content that absorbs a large share of the capacity of the network can't be charged for the additional congestion or depreciation effects associated with transporting its content. So if there are no differences in consumers of Internet services, if we all consume the same things, if we all looked at the Internet for the very same things, then net neutrality would be perfectly neutral. But in fact, there are differences. People have different interests. They demand different services from the Internet, which imposes different costs on the broadband providers. And so given that, net neutrality does require some consumers to subsidize the consumption of other consumers. And in that sense, net neutrality really can be viewed as a form of differential pricing, depending on how you define the service that's being provided. So I want to talk about a very simple story, basic economics of network neutrality, analogizing it to the bridge, to bridges. And then look at the case for cross-subsidies, whether there's a strong case, drawing analogies with what we know already about the law. Then I want to consider distributional arguments, then arguments about anti-competitive abuse as a justification for net neutrality, arguments about government coercion as a justification for net neutrality. Okay, so start off with a very simple analogy. You consider a bridge with two types of user, heavy trucks and light cars. The heavy trucks are imposing a greater cost on the bridge in terms of congestion, in terms of wear and tear. And of course, this means that the bridge providers of the bridge services are bearing a greater cost as a result of the truck traffic. Now, if the bridge owner is required to charge the same price for both the trucks and the light cars, then the cars are effectively cross-subsidizing the trucks, which leads to an overconsumption of the services by the trucks, underconsumption by the cars. If the bridge owner were allowed to charge different usage prices to the trucks and the cars, then that would allow the bridge owner to internalize those costs that are imposed on the other drivers and on the bridge owner to the trucks, which would encourage efficient consumption. It would encourage sorting. Some trucks would decide not to use the bridge at all, choose a different route, and technological change that would favor efficient consumption of services over time by the trucks. Okay, so admittedly this may not happen. There may be administrative reasons why a bridge owner might choose not to charge different prices. It may be too much of a hassle to charge different prices. But anyway, this is what is likely to happen if you don't have any regulation on the prices charged by the bridge owner and the administrative costs are sufficiently low. So the bridge analogy, I want to take that bridge analogy or the bridge story and apply it to the Internet. In the case of the Internet, we have certain services like Netflix, which are the equivalent of the heavy trucks, that are imposing extraordinary congestion costs as a result of the cross-subsidy from other consumers of Internet services. So what I want to think about is there a justification for cross-subsidies? And in general, in the presence of externalities, it's not hard to come up with a justification for cross subsidies. And it's very easy to start with go back to the bridge analogy that I started with. Suppose the trucks are providing a service that benefits all consumers or all users of the bridge. So, for example, the trucks are supplying vaccines to people, and vaccines provide a benefit to the people who use them and for the people who don't use the vaccines as well. So under that scenario, cross-subsidy from light cars to trucks might be desirable. If most of the trucks are carrying vaccines, then a general subsidy in favor of the trucks might be optimal, might be socially optimal. The question is, does this cross-subsidization theory have any application to the internet or for markets for informational services? If we ask ourselves, is there some information service that provides a benefit to everyone? Well, the obvious answer would be educational services, or services that enhance the stock of human capital and make society more productive, or services that otherwise advance science and culture. If we think about the law, then there is a cross-subsidy. There is an analogous cross-subsidy that we can find in the law, and that's the fair use doctrine in copyright law. The fair use doctrine imposes a cross-subsidy in which the holder of a copyright, in a sense, provides a subsidy to the infringer. If the infringer's use is fair, then the copier's use is deemed fair, then the infringer doesn't have to pay, or the copier, as infringer, doesn't have to pay the fee, a license, and won't be found to be guilty of infringement. Fair use is determined by several factors, such as the amount of copying and the purpose of the copying. But one of the major purposes that leads to a finding of fair use is educational purposes. So education that, again, enhances the stock of human capital would be a reason why a court might find that someone who has copied, infringed another person's copyright isn't guilty of infringement after all, and so in effect impose this cross-subsidy from one provider of an information service, the copyright holder, to another provider of an information service, the person who copies. And so there are plenty of examples in which the fair use designation has been made. Most of them involve fairly light cases of copying, but also educational purposes are a major reason for finding uses to be fair. Satire, for example, is arguably an educational purpose and has been a reason why courts have found copying to be fair in some circumstances. And so the most recent example I can think of is the book The Wind Done Gone versus Gone with the Wind. The Wind Done Gone tells the story from Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind from the eyes of the slaves rather than the eyes of the slave holders. And so a court looking at this deemed this version to be a fair use and therefore said it doesn't violate the copyright of Gone with the Wind. And I think this is a justifiable holding under the theory that I've just set out because the court said we view this as a parody, a form of satire. And satire has the benefit of education. It actually exposes to people ways in which they thought about things were wrong or questionable, and does so in a way that catches everyone's attention. So in this sense, the fair use doctrine imposes a cross-subsidy that's actually good for society, enhances social welfare, and is perfectly justifiable. Cross-subsidization of the sort required by the net neutrality principle could be justified on the same basis as the fair use doctrine. So the question that raises is, does that fair use-based theory of cross-subsidization have any application to the internet? And it's not clear that it does. I mean, take, for example, the case of Netflix. I'm not a heavy consumer of Netflix myself, but from what I've been able to see, I can't say that the content provided there is educational or enhances the stock of human capital. You know, the most popular show, House of Cards, offers a cynical view of American politics, but that kind of cynical view has been around in the literature for a long time, and so I can't say that's really doing much to, change to make society more productive or advance culture. My wife has been watching Mad Men replays on Netflix lately. And if anything, I think it's made her troubled and worried more than anything else. So I don't think it's having a good effect. In fact, I advised her to stop watching Mad Men. Well, there's another story in favor of cross subsidies, which is the network effect story. And Larry White has talked about that already. And that depends on empirical factors that haven't been settled. And of course, it may not capture all of the important externalities, but I won't say anything more about the network externalities defense of the network neutrality norm. So what about distributional considerations? So if you take a Rawlsian view of social welfare, you might say, well, maybe it's a good idea to have the network neutrality principle because it might work to favor less advantaged people. But in fact, if you look at cross subsidies in the area of informational services, for the most part, they work the other way. They tend to be regressive in impact. So take the case of the British Broadcasting Corporation, which is based on government support and therefore affects a cross subsidy of a sort. Well, I think the major beneficiaries are the wealthier as a result of the BBC service. So it imposes a coerced transfer from relatively less advantaged people in favor of the relatively advantaged people. And so that's undesirable unless there's some strong efficiency case for it. Does the same distributional argument work in favor of net neutrality? Well, again, take the case of Netflix. Well, I'm not sure that it does. I can't find any evidence that on distributional grounds you would want to impose the subsidy that favors the net neutrality-based subsidy that favors Netflix. So I took a look at the demographics. So Netflix subscribers are, let's see, gender, fairly evenly split. Age 37% are millennials. Residential status, slightly more likely to be adults living with parents. Suburban living, 50% live in the suburbs, which is slightly more than average. Household income, more than 50% have household incomes over $50,000, 23% over $100,000. Well, anyway, you get the picture. These are not the poorest of the poor who are Netflix consumers. So so these factors suggest the average Netflix consumer is wealthier than the average U.S. citizen. So on distributional grounds, the net neutrality norm probably operates as a regressive tax by requiring less advantaged people to support the consumption of more advantaged people. So given in the face of this distributional effect, there has to be a strong efficiency basis, I think, for supporting the net neutrality norm. And yet I don't find that. The efficiency arguments are, for the most part, speculative, unproven, probably likely to be proven invalid once all the evidence gets taken into account. So we have the net neutrality norm that imposes a regressive tax on society and offers an unclear benefit in terms of general efficiency, and probably no benefit in terms of general efficiency. If I were to think of a general norm that I would prefer, I would certainly suggest a Rawlsian sort of norm that, in general, you just favor government programs that coercively transfer from the less advantaged to the more advantaged, unless there's some strong efficiency basis for doing so. And so when I apply that norm to Netflix, and I would favor that norm over the net neutrality norm. When I apply that norm to this context, net neutrality suffers. Okay, so what about anti-competitive abuse, which is another story, anti-competitive abuse by vertically integrated firms. So if I go back to the bridge analogy, there's a perfect case that applies to this context, a case called U.S. versus Terminal Railroad, where a consortium of railroads got together and purchased the terminal facilities, and in essence purchased the bridge leading over to St. Louis, crossing the Mississippi River, and therefore put itself in a position to charge discriminatory prices to competing railroad services. Okay, so in effect that could happen in this context too. That a vertically integrated broadband provider could discriminate against the content of other firms, and that might be undesirable and might provide a basis for the net neutrality principle. So here there are a couple of considerations. One, it's been mentioned already. Michael Katz mentioned it at the start, and I think we've had other people mention as well, that we have antitrust law already, and antitrust seems to be sufficient to deal with this problem. Moreover, antitrust is superior because an antitrust court that considers the anti-competitive complaint is going to consider the efficiency justifications behind the defendant's actions as well, whereas the net neutrality principle just throws out the efficiency considerations, it ignores them. So it's not only is antitrust probably sufficient, antitrust is superior to the net neutrality principle if we're really concerned about social welfare. Also, the market, this has been mentioned already, the market provides constraints on anti-competitive abuse, both the competition for consumers, competition in the capital market as well. So if investors think that the owner of a facility might degrade the value of that facility by favoring its content over the content of rival providers, that's going to hurt the firm in the capital markets. So we had a really glaring example of that a few months ago with the case of Keurig, the maker of these brewing devices, because Keurig launched a plan to freeze out the makers of these rival K-Cups. The K-Cups, everywhere you go now you find these coffee K-Cups. Keurig was going to freeze out the makers of rival K-Cups through technological integration by making it so that the makers of rival K-Cups would not produce a product that was technologically conformable with the new Keurig brewing machine. Well, anyway, once the stock market got wind of this, it punished Keurig's stock price so severely and swiftly that Keurig changed its mind. It about-faced and said, no, we're going to stick with the brewing device that we have right now that does not freeze out, does not exclude rival makers of K-Cups. And this is in spite of the fact that Keurig probably has monopoly power in the brewing device area, doesn't really face much competition, and at this point the antitrust penalties haven't become a big concern. So it's capital market competition that put a serious constraint on Keurig's ability to use its platform to freeze out rivals in this vertically associated service. Increasingly, this is an important form of competition. If you talk to people in the business area, they'll say, our business used to be controlled by salespeople. Now it's controlled by finance people. And finance people are always thinking about what any business decision is going to do for the firm's ability to compete in the market for capital. So this is a major constraint. It's increasingly becoming a major constraint. It may be one of the reasons, to go back to Tim Brennan's remarks, maybe one of the reasons why we've seen very few, if any, of these violations of the net neutrality principle. Okay, well, anyway, the biggest problem in this area, I think, is really one of Schumpeterian competition, dynamic competition, that for these network providers to be able to provide the best quality networks, it requires substantial capital investments, and they won't do this unless there's some prospect of earning a return, some prospect of limited monopoly power. And so there's a chicken and egg kind of innovation competition where content providers themselves are becoming more innovative, and there are things that are happening that make the content more demanding of broadband capacity. The smart devices issue that was brought up earlier. So as a result, given this form of competition in innovation, I think it will be true that we'll always see a market in which it appears that some providers of broadband capacity are in a position to abuse their customers, have monopoly power. That is, if you define the quality of the service at a sufficiently high level, you're always going to find a small number of firms providing that level of quality. I think that will be a proposition that is true going forward. As a result, I don't think we're ever going to escape the issue of things of an observation of possibly anti-competitive conditions. I think that's always going to be there in this market because that's the relationship between investment and quality and competition in this area. The final argument to consider is one of government coercion. The network neutrality principle can be offered as a bulwark against government coercion, allowing the government to control what the internet is providing to people. And there are really two arguments to be concerned there. One is the issue of internet privacy. And that's an area where government coercion can be a benefit, after all. And by government coercion, I mean letting the courts take a serious look at what the internet service providers are doing. So as you know, we have content providers suing the broadband firms, suing internet service providers, and saying, you know, you're not doing enough to protect our copyrights or to protect our trademarks, because you've got makers of cheap knockoff products violating the trademarks or coming close to violating the trademarks and offering this stuff on the internet all the time. And so, in general, I'm not in favor of making the broadband providers strictly liable to these victims of intellectual property theft. And the law is pretty much at that position right now with the MGM versus Grokster case of 2005. On the other hand, you know, negligence principles probably need to play a role in this area to induce broadband providers to do a better job of trying to control the theft of intellectual property over the internet. That, I think, is an issue where there's some room for optimal government coercion. And you could see the network neutrality principle being offered as a preemption defense. Some broadband providers may like network neutrality because they could say, well, hey, we got this rule, network neutrality, and so it preempts the application of tort liability or any kind of liability, intellectual property liability, for the theft of intellectual property over the broadband networks. Here, if this were the case, then I think the network neutrality principle as a preemption argument is bad. I mean, that's negative. It gets in the way of optimal regulation. And the other form of government coercion is a government that tries to control speech through the internet. And here, I think, you know, in the U.S., where we have a strong First Amendment, there's no need for that, for net neutrality. In fact, it's hard for me to see what the net neutrality norm could provide that the First Amendment doesn't give us already. And so the First Amendment ought to be sufficient to control this question. The other concern is, what about other countries? What about countries in which there is no strong protection of free speech? Well, in those countries, the network neutrality principle really doesn't matter at all because the government can control directly what people are saying and punish people for what they say or what they look at. So network neutrality would just be a smokescreen in those countries. So it couldn't possibly provide a benefit for those situations. Okay, so I'm out of time. I think I've said enough. I think I got to at least sketch out the arguments that I wanted to bring up, and I'll stop here. Thank you very much.